So I'm doom scrolling Twitter one day when I see this tweet from Luke Thomas about fighters' records from 125 to 170 diving off a cliff in title fights when they're over the age of 35. He had screenshotted an older tweet on the topic that was several fights before his new tweet, which is why there's a sudden jump in the number of fights after Colby reached the 7th layer of hair against Rocky, 2-31. That is a crazy stat, and it got me thinking somebody should take this further. Not just 125 to 170, but every division, and not just title fights, but all fights. That much data would give us an insanely comprehensive look at when it is that fighters start to have issues with winning related to their age in the octagon. We could find out if there is an age where statistically fighters start to see a steeper decline. Of course, that would require hundreds of hours of data entry and analysis. Who would be stupid enough to do that just because they were curious after reading a tweet? I'm Tommy from MMA On Point. A massive shout out to our channel Hall of Famers, and this is the age of decline when fighters drop off. Now, in order to pinpoint the age when fighters start to lose at a statistically significant rate in comparison to what is considered normal based on all the data we ran, the very first thing I needed to do was to go onto the UFC stats website and transfer every single fight from every single fighter into an Excel spreadsheet. I don't know if you're aware of this, but when you start getting into row 30 or 40,000 in Excel, unless you're using a computer at NASA, it's going to start overloading your system. So I ended up having to do this by division on separate sheets before adding it all back together once I was able to clean everything up. And by clean everything up, I mean I had to get rid of any fight that wasn't in the UFC. You see, the UFC stats website doesn't just list UFC bouts. Any property TKO now owns, like Strikeforce or Pride, those are listed too, as are a surprising number of promotions like Dream. There's a ton of stuff you wouldn't expect to see that needed filtered out. I also got rid of any fight that happened prior to UFC 28, which is when MMA adopted the unified rules, thus starting the modern era of the sport. I like my data clean and relevant. Once I sorted out that giant mess, I had to find the birthdays of every single UFC fighter and add those to the spreadsheet as well. A few brutal weeks later, I finally had my data set: 7,175 fights. Anyway, I then partnered up with my good buddy ChatGPT, who may suck at helping you plagiarize your term paper, but is fantastic at giving me Excel formulas I wouldn't have a clue how to make, and it does a bang-up job of helping me interpret the data I found, which is why you're here. So enough preamble, let's get into the big show, the analysis.
Well, we're waiting.
In data analysis, one helpful measure is called the mode, and what that does is tell you the most frequently appearing value in a data set. For example, Jim Miller would be considered the UFC's mode because he has appeared in fights more frequently than any other athlete. In the context of our UFC spreadsheet, would you believe the mode for the number of fights in a career, so in other words, the number of fights total most often had by a fighter who enters the UFC, is just 2. To put it even more simply, 30% of fighters who make it to the UFC will only ever have 2 fights, which is not the same as the average career. Averages are when we add all the data up and then divide it by how many data points we had to give us a more general idea of the whole data set, a snapshot of the middle essentially. To go back to Jim Miller to help us understand, he has 12 UFC submissions in 43 fights, which means he's averaging a submission every 3.58 fights. So what does the average UFC fighter look like based on our data? Well, they enter the promotion at 28 years old, and they will on average be gone by 31. In those 3 years, they will have 6 to 7 bouts, and only 9.64% of them will get a chance to compete for a divisional championship. The average age at which a fighter will reach that title match is 31, the same age on average fighters are done with their careers. So 31 is the age of reckoning in this sport. It's the point on average where you either make it to the top or you don't. What might be surprising to you though is that 45% of all fighters who have ever made it to a title bout will only ever compete in that one title bout. So essentially half of everybody who has ever competed in the 326 title bouts since UFC 28 got their one chance to blow, and the opportunity truly only came once in a lifetime, which really makes you appreciate the insanely long runs that some of the all-time greats have had in comparison. Alright, those numbers were mostly to paint a picture for your average experience in the UFC. Let's get into some deeper analysis here. First, something that is intuitively obvious about the sport: the older you get, the harder it is to win. I know we all know this, but the data does back it up. Here is a graph of win rate by age depicting both non-title and championship bouts. You don't need to run through 7,000 fights to know that as a fighter gets older, it is harder to win. If we break this down by division, the exact same trend exists in every case, with weird outliers of course, like the absolutely bizarre women's 145 chart, but that division has never really had enough fighters for official rankings, so take it with a grain of salt. Here they all are overlapping each other, and while it's messy as hell, it does make that downward trend a bit more obvious. Win rate graphs alone don't paint the whole picture though, because the vast majority of fighters that are competing at any time in the UFC are not in their early 20s or late 30s. This frequency chart illustrates it perfectly. You can see this bell curve has a massive cap, with 28 to 31 being the most common range, which is also the peak of most fighters' careers in terms of winning percentage. At 30.9 years of age, they'll either peak with a title bout, or like 90% of all UFC fighters, never see that championship fight as they move further and further away from the title picture. Lastly, before we answer the question this entire piece is about, it should be noted that, as expected, we see that the larger the age gap between two fighters, the harder it is generally for the older fighter to win. While this chart after 10 plus years should be ignored considering how infrequently those types of matchups happen, in the far more common gaps starting at 2.5 years, you can see that as the age disparity widens, so does the win rate between the younger fighter and the older one, which is of course something that we would expect. The age gap might be one of the most deciding factors in the sport, as we see near parity when fighters compete at the same age. There have been 515 instances since 2000 where fighters competed at the same age and they split wins 45-55, so nearly right down the middle. In fact, we ran a key square test. You don't really need to know what that is besides the result it gives us, which is that there's essentially a 1.7% chance that age is not a major factor in wins and losses. Which, of course, yes, we all inherently know, but the data does heavily confirm that, and hey, if we took the time to run through 7,000 fights, why not be thorough with our explanation, huh? But okay, what about the reason we're here? Which is, of course, what does this mountain of data say about the age of decline? Does it fall in line with the trend that Luke Thomas noticed for title bouts from 125 to 170? Well, it's actually even steeper when it comes to champions when we expand past that 125 to 170 range to include all divisions. Fighters in title bouts start losing significantly more at 33 years old. How much so? Prior to that age, the expected win rate is 52.5%. After 33, it craters to 40.8%, which may not sound like that crazy of a jump, but statistically that is hugely significant, and it gets even worse if the other fighter is younger, which is the case 80% of the time. Then 33-plus-year-olds are only winning title bouts 35.6% of the time. And mind you, those numbers don't get any better as time goes on, but for weirdo freaks like Randy Couture. There is a huge title fight coming up between Alexander Volkanovski, who is very much over 33 years old at 35, defending his featherweight title against Ilia Topuria, a man 8 years his younger at 27. There's been 40 title bouts with an age gap of 8 years where the older fighter was 33 plus, and in those scenarios the win rate for the veteran drops another 3 points. So historically speaking, Volk has a 32% chance of defeating Topuria. I am so sorry, everybody. Alright, so we answered the question that the initial Luke Thomas tweet sparked about title fights. 33 years old is when champs start to drop off big time. But that was just one part of our curiosity, and that's only a decline in performance in title bouts. What about everybody else? What is the age of decline when we look at all 7,175 fights that happened in the last 23 years? UFC fighters tend to skew a bit older on average than other major sports. The average age of athletes in the NFL and NBA is 26. The average age of UFC fighters is 29.75. And we have seen a ton of great talent at older ages. I mentioned Randy Couture earlier. Daniel Cormier comes to mind. Vitor Belfort was kicking people's heads off at 37, and it was entirely, legit. Given all that, I assumed that the age of general decline might be a bit further along than that of the champions. But that is why we run the numbers, because I was wrong. It is at the age of 34, so just a year older than the champions, that we see a statistically significant drop-off in win percentages for fighters. Everybody 33 and younger is winning at a 51.06% clip. Everybody starting at 34, 40.26%, and it only gets worse after that. So nearly the same drop-off we saw with the champs shows up just a year later for everybody else. The reason we probably see a slight difference between champs and the rest of the field: one, we don't have anywhere near as much data on title fights because there's only been 326 of those compared to nearly 7,000 regular bouts, so maybe if there were 7,000 title fights, the numbers would line up just about the same. The other thing to consider I touched on briefly earlier: it's a decline in victories in title fights, the highest level of the sport, not the prelims, so it's possible that age affects winning and losing a bit more since these are the best of the best. Either way, we have our answer. answer. After all those numbers were run, we know the age of decline in mixed martial arts. It's 34, and you're going to start losing title fights at a more significant rate a year earlier at 33. A more grim aspect of this that I haven't mentioned up to now is that this decline is going to coincide with an increased risk of being finished in your bouts that only gets worse with more time. What we did today also shows just how brief a window fighters have for being elite in this sport, with the average championship contender being 31 and the drop-off in title fights starting at 33. Your prime is certainly not for long in mixed martial arts, making absolute freak shows like John Jones all the more insanely impressive. But as Ian Malcolm said, there it is, a long winding road with hundreds of hours of work to get a very simple answer to a seemingly simple question. 34 years old, the age of decline. But along the way, we also got a very broad picture of what careers look like in the UFC, so the juice was worth the squeeze and the action is the juice. But man, I can't emphasize enough that I'm not a statistician. If you are any kind of expert and you want to look at my books or anything else related to this data, just let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you and chat you up so we can keep on making better stats pieces. A massive thank you to Luke Taylor for the edit on this one. I know it was not fun with all the numbers and stats, but look how damn entertaining he made this thing. Follow him on his socials and send him pictures of pumpkins. He loves those. A massive shout out to our channel Hall of Famers. You guys are the real heroes, and now you can be a real hero at a reduced price, $7.99. It's better bang for your buck. You get all kinds of cool exclusive content, live chats, might even have a say in some of the videos. Just hit that join button down there. Or if you just want to show your appreciation for me running numbers for like 2 weeks straight, like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, everybody. Let's do another one of these again really soon. But not that soon, I'm kind of tired.